Welcome all of you wonderful, wonderful people. It's my pleasure to introduce Matt Clifford of Entrepreneurs First. Matt Clifford, MBE actually, as of yesterday. So Matt's the CEO of Entrepreneur First, the world's leading technology company builder. Entrepreneur First invests in top technical individuals to help them build world-class deep technology startups from scratch in London and Singapore. Since 2011, Entrepreneur First has created over 100 startups worth over $500 million. Matt left McKinsey to start Entrepreneur First because he believes the world's most talented people should be founders. He sits on the board of Tech for Trade, and Silicon Valley comes to the UK and is a global shaper at the World Economic Forum. Matt graduated from Cambridge prior to studying at MIT as a Kennedy Scholar.
Can you hear me? Oh. Yeah, you can hear me. Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes and just try and give a flavor of why I think starting a startup could be the most high-impact thing that you do. I'm going to make two confessions and one excuse before we start. One excuse, as we've already just heard, is I set up an entire business whose business model relies on this being true, so I do have a strong bias in this area. The second confession is that I seem to be coming down with a cold, so apologies if that becomes very nasal during the talk. And the third confession is, if you know a lot about startups, you're probably not going to learn anything new. What I hope to do in this talk is instead try and combine the words of effective altruism and startups such that if you know a little about either, then you'll learn something. But if you know a lot about startups, nothing breathtakingly transformative here. To kick off though, just a little bit about Entrepreneur First, because I think it is relevant backstory for what I'm going to try and argue. So Entrepreneur First is a company that I started with my co-founder Alice 5 years ago with a view that the world would be a much better place if the most ambitious people in our society started companies. So I really believe, I think it's one of the foundational beliefs of EF, that the default career path pursued by the most ambitious people has a profound impact on the shape of a society and an economy. And so if you look at Silicon Valley, which is probably, I think, the only place in the world where the default career path for the most ambitious people is to build companies, there you have an economy and a society that is built on innovation and building new products and new things that scale and are used by people across the world. And as in London, if your default career path is or has been for many years to go into finance, then you will have an economy that's dominated by financial services, and every 20 years or so destroys the rest of the economy. Whether or not that's true, that's not really the point of the talk. The point is that these dynamics about what do ambitious people want to do go way beyond the individual in their impact and actually have a much broader social and economic impact. So we start with this idea that, therefore, if you wanted to really make a difference to the startup ecosystem, and by extension, if you really wanted to have a big impact, then it wasn't enough just to say, yay, build more companies, and it wasn't enough to just raise a seed fund and provide capital to more companies, because both those solutions explain away the problem. They assume that there are great companies out there that just need more help or just need more cash, whereas actually what we believed was that just the people that you wanted to start companies weren't starting companies. And that's why we built this model, Entrepreneur First, which takes people before they have a company. Every 6 months we recruit 100 individuals pre-company, almost always pre-team, sometimes pre-idea, and then put them through a 6-month program of company building, during which they do even the kind of most fundamental thing of finding a team, finding someone to work with, most fundamental thing of finding an idea, deciding what they want to work on. When we started this 5 years ago, I think people thought it was pretty stupid. In fact, I know that because many people told me so. In particular, every investor that we went to pitch to ask for money for this told us it was a bad idea. But we pushed on. This is not a story where in the end, well, it is a story where in the end I was right, but that's also not the point of the story. The point of the story is that the reason I think that it sounded very stupid is that there's actually been some fundamental changes in the structure of the startup economy over the last 10 years that mean that this would have been a very, very stupid idea 10 years ago and isn't today. And they happen to be the same reasons that I think that startups can be very high impact. So I'm not going to spoil the punchline and go through them now, but over the next 10, 15 minutes, that's what I want to talk about. So just a few facts about what we do, because I think it's relevant. As I said, we find 100 individuals every 6 months and help them build companies. Through this model, we support over 400 people, which will grow to 1,000 by the end of 2018. We've built over 100 companies, which are doing pretty well between them. Some have been very successful earlier this year. A company called Magic Pony Technology, which we helped build, was bought by Twitter for $150 million, which was great. And we've had a couple of other fairly large exits. And what it's convinced us is that something very profound has changed in the way that startups are built. And those changes, as I say, are the same reasons I think that startups could be very high impact. So what I want to just say before we start is that I'm not suggesting, I'm not going to explain to you how startups make loads of money today. There are some good EA reasons to start startups if you believe that you will be successful. We can come back to that maybe in Q&A, what you'd have to believe you're successful. But there are some good reasons that say start a startup, make loads of money, give it away, loads of impact. But I'm not talking about startups today as a kind of earning to forgive vehicle. I'm talking about startups for direct impact, the actual impact that startups itself have. This other question is really interesting and worth exploring, but no time today. So instead, what I want to look at is the kind of impact that we're talking about in the rest of this conference and that most of you are interested in, I imagine, in your day-to-day lives. So I think a really useful framework, which Will uses in his book and GiveWell, I think, perhaps pioneered, someone will correct me if I'm wrong about that, is this idea that when we're thinking about what causes we want to work on, what kinds of impact we want to have, we would usually think about these kind of 3 criteria for choosing causes, choosing problems to solve. Are they important? Are they neglected? Are they tractable? And I remember reading this or rereading this in Will's book last year. And I liked Will's book so much that I bought a copy for every person that did EF, because I thought if they did, then something might happen. And when I read this and started thinking about this, I thought, what's interesting is this is also exactly the way that we think about choosing what to work on as entrepreneurs in conventional startups. Broadly, we might not use this language, in fact we typically don't, but broadly, if founders come to me or our team at EF and ask for advice about what they should work on, we say, well, you've got to choose something that's big. Starting a startup is really, really hard. In fact, most startups fail. So if you're going to go down this path, you might as well do something where if you succeed, it's really, really big and it matters. Secondly, you don't want to do something that people are doing well already. That seems pretty important. You wouldn't want to start a startup in the most competitive space. And thirdly, and most difficult to tell at the start, you need to do something that's possible. That might seem really obvious, but the reason that company that we were able to sell this summer is called Magic Pony Technology was that I used to give a talk at the start of every EF program called Don't Build a Magic Pony, which they've kind of ruined for me now. But the reason I gave that talk was that one of the most important factors in deciding whether a startup is a viable idea is to say, does anyone want it? Is there any demand? And a lot of entrepreneurs trick themselves into answering that question in the positive, yes, there is demand, by going out and promising something they can't deliver. So I used to say to people, if you go and ask 100 people on the street, do you want a magic pony? They'll say yes, but it doesn't mean you've proved demand unless you can build a magic pony. Whereupon Rob and Zihan, who always like proving a point, decided they would call their company that and then go and build a magic pony. But tractability is really important, and I think one of the main arguments for why startups can be really, really high impact is I would argue that startups as a kind of process or as a journey actually represent one of the most efficient mechanisms we know of for discovering tractability. One of the reasons I find startups very intellectually exciting is I see startups largely as a discovery process that combines talent and capital with a methodology that allows us to learn very, very quickly about whether something will work and whether it won't. And more importantly, or perhaps equally importantly, it allows us to attract capital in proportion to the amount of learning that we do. So when you say, I have this great idea for a, again, not yet talking about EA startups, just a great idea for a for-profit technology company, largely the venture capital market will give you funding to try that out in proportion to the certainty about the key assumptions that you're making, whether those are technical or whether those are demand-driven. And so if you take this idea of startups as being a great vehicle for discovering truths relatively quickly, relatively efficiently, and very effectively, then that just starts to plant a seed about why these might be great vehicles for having the kind of impact that we care about as EAs. And so what I want to argue for the remaining sort of 10, 15 minutes is that if you take that idea of startups as a discovery vehicle and then say, well, why would that lead to the kind of impact we care about? I think the short answer is one word, which is software. And that's not much of a talk, so I'm going to spend the rest of the 15 minutes explaining what I mean about why software is so powerful. I want to argue that software as a vehicle for entrepreneurship enables unprecedented scale, unprecedented scope, and unprecedentedly low costs. And that allows us, either thinking with our capitalist hats on or with our EA hats on, that allows us a way of taking an opportunity to have enormous impact. So I want to just work through these three ideas about scale, scope, and cost and show how, whether you care about just making money or whether you care about impact, startups can be a great vehicle for achieving these things. So scale is, in fact, the most important. Will and I were very briefly just before came on stage talking about this, and one of the points that Will made, which is a point I wanted to make as well, is that if you can do almost anything for 1 billion people that's valuable and not destructive, that's going to be really high impact. Maybe that sounds totally banal and obvious, but I think it's something that we often forget in our everyday lives, is that any positive number times 1 billion is really, really big. Another prominent person in the EA world, who wasn't Will, said to me on the phone a couple of months ago that they thought that the single most beneficial invention that you could come up with would be a for-profit dating app that increased the happiness of marriages post-dating. And if you could do that, that would probably have more positive impact than anything else that you could create. I just want to spend 2 minutes talking about what I mean by scale, because I think that even though we all say, oh yeah, scale, technology allows things to scale, very few of us really think about just how profound and just how huge this is. And this is my favorite chart for showing just how new the opportunity is to have massive impact through the scale of technology. So this strategically placed banner means you can't see the bottom side of this slide, but as you can probably see, it's just a timeline that runs 1995 to 2020. And up the side is millions of people. So in 1995, many, many people were able to get venture capital funding for companies that were going to use the internet as a distribution mechanism, largely on the basis of how many people were online and what a great way it was to reach people. So you talk to VCs who were active in the middle of that decade, and they'll say, yeah, it seemed like the internet was just this extraordinary opportunity. You could reach all these people, and anything that can reach that many people, surely there's a way of making money. So how many people are online to get these people so excited? About that many. 50 million people. That's not crazy, right? It's not crazy to think, wow, if I could reach 50 million people, I could have an enormous positive impact by selling something to each of those people or having some other positive impact on those people. And yet today, if someone was like, the internet's amazing, there are 50 million people on it, we'd think they were crazy. 5 years later, how many people are online? Remember, this is the peak of the dot-com bubble. By now, surely, there was just this extraordinary opportunity. And there was, but it was only 500 million people, 500 million people. I'm not going to labor the point. You get the punchline that we now have nearly 3 billion people online. And by 2020, we'll have nearly 4 billion people online. This is an opportunity, it's an overused word, but it is unprecedented in human history that you can reach 4 billion people to do anything. Literally anything. I have a different talk that I love to give about the disruption of ambition, and one of the things I say in that is, you take someone like Napoleon, who you may say is the most ambitious person in the 19th century, he would be so envious about the power that Mark Zuckerberg has. Napoleon didn't reach anything like 1.8 billion people in his lifetime. Tech has allowed unprecedented scale, which in turn allows unprecedented impact. But this is just conventional desktop, if you like, internet access. It gets even more exciting in terms of the pace of change and what we might be able to expect in terms of trajectory if you start to think about mobile. So how many people had a smartphone in 1995? Well, I can click and nothing will come up because no one had a smartphone in 1995. Everyone knows that. I can click again and no one had a smartphone in 2000. But by the time you get to 2014, well, maybe not enough clicks, you have 2 billion people have smartphones worldwide. And by 2020, it'll be nearly 4 billion people have smartphones. And what's really exciting is not just that so many different services can be delivered on the smartphone. What's really exciting is these are not the same people. The blue and the gray lines here are not the same people. In fact, what's amazing is that the scale that the internet provides is not straightforwardly correlated with existing wealth. In fact, smartphone penetration is growing faster in sub-Saharan Africa than anywhere else. Even today, we have about 15% smartphone penetration in sub-Saharan Africa. By 2020, 51%. So when I say that I think that starting a tech startup can be a vehicle for enormous impact, one of the most basic ways I mean that is simply that you can reach more people more profoundly than ever before. And you see this very obviously, there are some great EA organizations using this same phenomenon to do their work. Most obviously, perhaps Give Directly, that is using feature phones in sub-Saharan Africa to give via mobile money transfer. So that's scale. Scope. What do I mean by scope? I simply mean that we used to think of technology companies, and these were things like IBM, and then non-technology companies, and that was everything else. And now that's just not true. Nearly everything can be a technology company. Software is eating the world. This is the famous line of Mark Andreessen, the developer of the web browser. And it's absolutely true. Whatever kind of impact you want to have in whatever field of human activity, you can now have through technology. The biggest transportation company, the land transportation company, certainly the biggest taxi company is a software company, Uber. The biggest hospitality company, Airbnb, is a software company. Some of you will know Wave, the software company that allows remittances to be sent very, very cheaply to Africa, set up, I think, with explicitly EA goals. Or things like Babylon, which allows healthcare access to be made through a smartphone to a UK-trained doctor. All these things mean that the scope of what's possible through a technology company is greater than ever before. In fact, a lot of people are now saying that, rather than talking about technology companies and non-technology companies, that would be as silly as talking about electricity companies, meaning companies that use electricity, and non-electricity companies. All companies are electricity companies. All companies are technology companies. And finally, cost, because I want to leave lots of time for questions. This, I think, is the most profound one. I think that historically, ambitious people who want to have a large amount of impact have been drawn to institutions that will give them the leverage to have that impact. I think what entrepreneurship, particularly technology entrepreneurship, software entrepreneurship, gives you is the ability to have that impact without needing a huge amount of institutional apparatus behind you. The clearest way to see this, I think, is to think about the most powerful entrepreneurs of the 20th century, people like this guy, J.P. Morgan, who got his power by writing checks to other people, and his scale and his impact came through writing checks. To one of the most powerful entrepreneurs of the 21st century, Mark Zuckerberg, who got there by writing code. I like to think there's something strangely and surprisingly Marxist about this. The reason that software entrepreneurship is so powerful as a vehicle for having impact is because entrepreneurs are their own means of production. Mark Zuckerberg actually wrote the code that built the first version of Facebook, so he didn't need a J.P. Morgan to write him a check. He owned his own means of production. That is a vehicle that gives you as an entrepreneur an enormous amount of control, which is very important for mission and vision, but also an amazing amount of scale and ability to have an impact. There's lots and lots of fundamental things driving this. This is not just an inexplicable or even cyclical phenomenon. I think these are long-term secular changes that aren't going away. The rise of things like open source software. This is the GitHub logo. Open source software, for those of you who don't know, basically means making the code that powers something available free of charge to anyone who wants to use it. Why is that so profoundly important? Why does that make technology companies higher impact? Because it means that you don't have to reinvent the wheel when you want to start from scratch. In fact, nearly anything that you can imagine up to the very cutting edge is available free of charge online, and you can just download that code base and start from there as your baseline. This enormously magnifies the impact of individual technology entrepreneurs and allows them to have more impact. Things like Amazon Web Services. It used to be that you had to raise millions of dollars, and I know people had to do this, before you started a technology company in order to physically buy the servers that the company would run on. If you tell that to a technology entrepreneur in 2016, they'll think you're crazy. Google and Amazon and Microsoft literally pay entrepreneurs now, at least at EF, to use their hosting platforms like AWS in order to try and win their business. So you've gone from a huge upfront capital cost to people literally paying you. This is another way in which technology entrepreneurship has this natural, or rather baked-in economics that allow scale, allow much, much faster progress. Most importantly of all, from an EA perspective, if you can have a positive impact through each unit achievement of your company, unlike a purely not-for-profit or purely charitable endeavor, you don't have to worry about funding. In fact, one of the amazing things about startups is that they are, beyond a certain point, self-funding, or at least they attract funding in proportion to their success. And so one of the most exciting things is that if you can have a positive social impact with your company, then you will not have to constantly plow in or raise new money. In fact, beyond a certain point, the money is self-generating. And that gives you another vehicle, another way of having that impact. I want to wrap up very, very quickly now because I'm conscious of time and I want to leave time for questions. But if you think about startups as self-funding, self-scaling, discovery mechanisms for finding out what's true and what will work, they seem very, very exciting. So exciting, in fact, that we might then say, well, can't we use these same mechanisms to think about using the startup methodology for not-for-profits? And I think the short answer to that is we absolutely can, and there are some really exciting startup-style, EA-style organizations being formed right now. I think this is going to be an area of massive growth. People essentially trying to find the next AMF or similarly effective charities. And that's something that I think the startup world can learn a lot from EA, and EA can learn a lot from startups as we think about that. I'm going to stop there because I know we started late and I know we need to run to time. But to recap briefly, I think that if you think about starting a technology startup as a vehicle for discovering what works, then if you can find something that has positive impact with each unit of progress, then the natural advantages that technology brings in terms of scale, in terms of scope, and in terms of the low cost at which they have to run, means that startups can be an amazing vehicle for positive impact in the world. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. We're going to go to Q&A now, and we're going to run it through Slido. So if you go on your phone to www.slido.com, SLIDO, and the code is EAGxOxford.
I might plant some questions, actually.
And you can see the questions that others have put up there, so you can upvote the questions that you'd like to see asked. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to just do that, or a minute or two.
Good questions. Shall I start answering that top one, just on the basis that it's got a lot of answers?
Yeah. So should you do a startup right after university degree or after some industry experience?
It's a really great question, and it's something that we at EF have evolved our views on over the last 5 years. So Entrepreneur First started very explicitly as a kind of grad-focused program, taking people right out of university. We still do some of that today, but it's fallen to fewer than a third of the people that join us. The way we today think about the answer to this question is an idea that we call EDGE, E-D-G-E. And I'm going to try and answer in about 30 seconds, but if you're interested in how we think about this, if you go to our Medium page, medium.com/entrepreneurfirst, we have lots and lots of writing on this question. In short, we think that if you want to be a founder, you're going to need some sort of personal competitive edge. It's really, really tough to be successful as a founder of any sort of company, and therefore starting without an edge is really a recipe for failure. What do I mean by edge? Well, we mean that you need to have something in your skills, in your experience, in your background that is going to make you more likely to succeed than another founder in the same space. Typically at EF, we see sort of 3 main types of edges being useful. One is a technical edge. EF focuses largely on what we call deep technology companies, by which we just mean companies where technology represents one of the differentiating factors in the product. So if you have a technical edge, what that means is that your technical skills allowed you to build something differentiated. If you get to the end of university and you genuinely have a technical edge, as in you think you, based on the skills that you've accumulated to date, you genuinely have an opportunity to build something differentiated, despite the fact that many other people have, say, a degree in computer science, then you may well be ready to start a company on that basis. That doesn't apply to many people, but it does apply to a few, and I certainly wouldn't want to put those people off. The second edge we look at is what we call a domain edge, which is where someone really, really understands a particular problem, either in an industry or in an activity or some area of life, and their understanding of that problem and in solving that problem is what will give them their edge. That one typically does tend to come after a little bit of experience. It's very unlikely that you would have a domain edge in fixing investment banking after one summer internship. It's possible, but it's very, very unlikely. So people who join EF with a domain edge typically have 3 to 10 years of industry experience. And then we have something called product edge, which is people who have unusually strong ability to turn ideas into products. Not always this, well, very different from technical edge. This is not about building differentiated technology. This is about actually productizing that technology. Interestingly, I think this is the area where we see the highest proportion of relatively younger and less experienced people. I think if you do a lot of building of products in your spare time, you really can have a genuine product edge by the time you graduate. But in general, probably we now feel that having at least a little bit of experience post-graduation is useful for starting a startup. I think often that experience is not actually best gained in a startup, but in acquiring that domain expertise in the area that you're most interested in.
Okay. And so how do you decide whether somebody is a good fit for the EF program?
Well, it's a bit of an industrial process at EF because we have many thousands of applicants and can only take a couple of hundred people. So what we're really looking for is sort of 3 things. We've discussed one, edge. We want everyone to have an edge, and we talk about that throughout the selection process. We ask people to explain what they think their edge is and to demonstrate that. We're looking for a set of, the second one, a set of founder characteristics. And again, if you go to our Medium page, we've written extensively about what those are. A lot around resilience and determination and strategicness and things like that. And then we're looking for nearly everyone that joins, 95% plus the people that join, we're looking for a set of technical skills that allow them to make a contribution to the product from day one. And if you take those 3 things together, that's how we make our decisions.
So, don't you think software startups are becoming a crowded space?
I mean, to go back to what I said in my talk, I would say that's a little bit like saying, don't you think electricity startups are becoming a crowded space? In short, no. I think software is going to be key to nearly every scaling company in the future. I think there are certainly areas that I think are highly, highly crowded. One of our banners that we use at EF says, don't build a dating app, build the future. And I think dating apps are probably a slightly crowded space, or at least a well-competed and effectively competed space. I think photo sharing is probably in the same category, but I think if you were to say, look at less sexy areas like shipping, or logistics, or forestry, or babysitting, or gas production, energy optimization in large manufacturing plants. These are all places where software companies could have huge impact. Even if we then think about this kind of idea of serving the bottom billion, services for the unbanked, they're almost certainly going to be software services. Services for access to public health information, they're almost certainly going to be software companies. And these spaces I don't think are remotely crowded. In fact, it'd be great to see them become crowded.
Is there a chance that another crash, like a dot-com crash, is approaching due to oversaturation, especially in the mobile market?
I think there's 2 separate things here that people often confuse, and it's really, really important to separate them. One is that venture capital, as an asset class, does appear to be cyclical. In other words, venture capital tends to go through waves where it becomes very, very, very hot and people get very, very excited, and far too many people invest in startups, far too much money is poured into them. You get kind of your grandmother pitching you startup ideas and that sort of thing, and that's when you know that venture capital might be headed for a challenging situation. And I think we will see at some point at least a deflation in where we are in the venture capital cycle, if not a crash. However, crucially, that is not at all the same as talking about a crash in either the prospects for technological development or startups themselves. One of the really interesting things about startups is that the returns that come from the most successful companies don't appear to diminish during periods of venture capital kind of down cycles. In other words, the best companies still get funded and the worst companies are the ones that fall away. So really, great entrepreneurs shouldn't be too worried about crashes in venture capital. I don't think that I do think that there are long-term secular drivers of the changes I was talking about, things like open source software, things like the falling cost of computation, things like the larger market size that's enabled by global smartphone penetration. And so whereas in 2000, when there was a huge boom that was kind of driven by hype and expectation, what we have now is the actuality that you really can reach 1 billion people and monetize those people, or you really can reach people in every continent of the world and provide something valuable to those people. That's not going to go away.
Okay, great. I think in the interest of time, we'll take that as our last question.
Thanks very much.
Can you join me in thanking Matt for his time?
Thanks very much.